Not.
Okay, okay. One second. Coming now, screen. Okay. Shall I start?
No, you are. Yeah.
Can start now?
Actually, hello. It is. You have to rotate the screen. The photo is like that.
Okay, okay. How to rotate? How to rotate, bro?
Go to the gallery. Gallery is in the top. So button will be there. The options.
This one.
Click that photo. No.
This one.
No. Go to that photo.
Edit.
No. Edit. First you enter into that photo. Oh. That side. This. Yeah. Left side and lower down. Okay. Take.
Can take now.
Take.
Difficult only. All photos are come like that only. Like just rotate the mobile and see no.
Okay. Carry on.
Okay. Shall I start?
Okay.
Pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors, they account for less than 3% of the pancreatic neoplasm. And recent 2 decades, there is a 7-fold increase in the pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors. Okay, and pancreatic neuroendocrine comprise 7% of all gastroenteropancreatic neuroendocrine tumors. The term functional should be reserved for tumors associated with clinical symptoms. Just not the peptides level increased. It should be clinical symptoms should be there. Then only it is called functional. Then non-functional, historically they present with usually present with pain and mass, but recently more frequently they present incidentally on the imaging. Okay, non-functional tumor mostly present as incidental finding, not as pain and mass effect, which used to be happening before. Coming to histopathology and staging, incidence of malignancy in this tumor varies approximately 10% in insulin secreting to almost 100% in glucagonoma and somatostatinoma. Means insulinoma is almost relatively benign, and glucagonoma and somatostatinoma is almost malignant. Malignancy can only definitely determined by presence of metastasis, not that basal invasion, all those things. It is presence of metastasis definitely determine the this malignancy. Coming to this table, this WHO classification of neuroendocrine tumors, it classified into low grade, intermediate grade, high grade. Low grade is G1 and high grade is G3. Intermediate can be both grade 2 or grade 3. And it based on four characteristics. First is appearance. It is homogeneous, small, round cell with abundant expression of neuroendocrine markers in the low grade, and pleomorphic cells with nuclear irregularity and necrosis in poorly differentiated. Coming to mitotic rate, less than 2 mitosis per 10 high power field in low grade, and intermediate it differs in grade 2 and grade 3. In grade 2, it is 2 to 20 mitosis per 10 high power field, and grade 3 greater than 20 mitosis in 10 high power field. Whether in high grade, irrespective of the only grade 3 is there, it is more than 20 mitosis, no 2 to 20 and all. And Ki-67 index in low grade, it is less than 3%. And intermediate, again, it differs in grade 2 and grade 3. In grade 2, it is 3 to 20%, and grade 3 is more than 20%. And here also in high grade, more than 20%, only more than 20%. Coming to behavior, low grade has behavior and
okay.
And in behavior, indolent in low grade, and poorly differentiated, it is aggressive. Coming to, there are 2 classification system actually, staging system. One is the AJCC 8th edition and European neuroendocrine tumor staging system. Both are almost similar, only with the little differences we have to note down actually. Coming to T1, it is in AJCC 8th edition, it is maximum tumor diameter, less than 2 centimeter in T1, 2 to 4 centimeter in T2, more than 4 centimeter in T3. And if a tumor invades celiac axis and superior mesenteric artery, it is T4. In a European classification staging system, tumor is limited to pancreas in T1, 2, and 3. It is less than 2, 2 to 4, and more than 4, similar to AJCC. But in T3, one additional point we have to know, that is invading duodenum and common bile duct also, they consider it is T3. Invading adjacent structure, they consider it as T4. And nodal metastasis also, there is some difference. N1 and N2 there in AJCC 8th edition, and European classification there is only N1. N1 here is 1 to 3 lymph nodes in N1, 4 or more in N2. If any lymph node positive, it is only N1 is there in European classification. Coming to staging, it is very easy to remember actually. Stage 4 is any M1. Okay, that you need not remember. But and one more is stage 1. Stage 1 in both it is T1 and T2. T1 is 1A, T2 is 1B. There is no nodal and distal metastasis. Coming to stage 2, okay, it is T3 and any N, actually they are given N2 actually. I think it should be corrected as N1. Any T3 and any N1 is considered your stage 2. And stage 3 is any T4 and N2. Okay. Coming to the next paragraph down, it is a grade 1 and grade 2 tumors are considered well differentiated as it is seen in WHO, and is by yearly most important prognostic indicator. That is, grading is the most important prognostic indicator in neuroendocrine tumors. High grade tumors, sometimes they refer to as neuroendocrine carcinoma. That is high grade or poorly differentiated. That is type 3 in WHO. They consider as neuroendocrinal carcinoma, account for less than 3% of the neuroendocrine tumors. Okay, both this AJCC and European classification neither includes the tumor grade. As I mentioned, tumor grade is the important prognostic indicator, but either the system does not include the grading system. They separately did one more system, that is TGM. They skipped the nodal. They took tumor, grade, and metastasis. Okay, it gave accurate prognostic tool. Okay, then surveillance and epidemiology end result database 8th edition AJCC staging system exhibited the good prognostic discrimination across the stages in both resected and unresected patients. AJCC 8th edition is good with respect to surveillance, epidemiology, and end results database. Okay. Next, coming to molecular genetics of molecular genetics, mostly all neuroendocrine tumors are sporadic only. Most common genetic syndrome associated with pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor is MEN1. Okay, MEN1, as it is mentioned, it is 3P actually. Pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor, parathyroid adenoma, and pituitary adenoma. MEN is usually caused by mutation in menin gene. Okay, it is an autosomal dominant, and you should remember the chromosome, that is 11q13. MEN is a component of histone methyl transferase complex, and it is, and one more thing you have to remember is MEN1 is tumor suppressor gene. Okay, menin is a protein, is a component of histone methyl transferase complex involved in G1 to S phase cell cycle regulation. G1 to S, they can alter this any to G2, all those things. Just remember G1 to S. Okay. Then another syndrome associated Von Hippel-Lindau. Von Hippel-Lindau, the tumors associated are renal cell carcinoma, pheochromocytoma, and tumors of CNS, retina, epidermitis, inner ear, and pancreatic lesions. Okay. Usually, what are the pancreatic lesions seen in Von Hippel-Lindau? There are 3 lesions. One is the neuroendocrine tumor, of course. One more is microcystic adenoma. Okay, sorry. The pancreatic lesions are observed in Von Hippel-Lindau. That is, one is neuroendocrine tumor, obviously, and one more is microcystic adenoma. Another is simple cyst. Okay, anyway, these 3 are there. They can give an option and accept all those things. Okay, often in Von Hippel they are multifocal, pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor associated with generally behave indolent. So they can be observed until they reach at least 2 to 3 centimeter. Usually, all the next chart and all will be seeing that neuroendocrine tumor less than 2 centimeter we observe, because in one nipple window, usually they are indolent. You can observe up to 3 centimeter also. Okay. And one more thing, MCQ they can ask is that specific exon 3 of the VHL gene may be associated with more aggressive phenotype, variated and closer surveillance is needed. It is similar to our beta-catenin mutation. As we know, exon 3 is more malignant and exon 7 and 8 is not a malignant. Here also exon 3 is more aggressive, van Hippel window. Okay. Then most, as I said before, most neuroendocrine tumor are sporadic only. Other than family history, there is no other risk factor is noted. Like smoking, all those things are usually they are not noted. And coming to this diagram, the chart what they were given, there is nothing in that actually. This menin regulates P27 and P28, you can remember, and menin and regulates G1 to S phase, that you can remember. And one more thing I have marked in this description is that cell-to-cell communication, endocrine cells such as beta cells and alpha cells rely on endothelium to provide extracellular matrix, which disables the attachment requirement needed for cell cancer to invade and migrate. Other things and all, I also didn't understand. I think we can't ask any MCQ also from this. Okay, there are total 149 genes are identified to be affected in pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors. Just don't see this paragraph, will be confusing. I have written actually above that MEN1 is mutated in 44% of pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor, and DAX and ATRX, they are mutated in 25% and 18% respectively. Okay, this percentage is important actually. Okay, and one more interesting point is MEN1 mutation and all these 3 mutation, if they are present, there is prolonged survival compared to if they are not present. Okay, this is one MCQ they can ask. And other mutation that can be present is mammalian target for rapamycin. Protein is a serine threonine kinase cellular pathway playing important role in regulation of cell growth and proliferation. So mTOR is upregulated in several tumors, including neuroendocrine tumor. So everolimus is FDA approved because mTOR is, as we can see in this box, next box I'll go actually. mTOR is mutated in almost 15% of the neuroendocrine tumor of pancreas. So everolimus is a FDA approved drug for the treatment. And this table is very important. They can ask MCQ from this actually, because there is more 0 and 100% and all is there. So as I said, MEN1, it is 44% in pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor, but ductal adenocarcinoma, it is 0%. And DAX, it is 25%, ATRX, it is 18%. They combined and made it as 43 here. So here 0% means MEN, DAX and ATRX not seen in ductal. MTOR is 16% as I said, and very less absent in ductal adenocarcinoma. 53, 85%, as we know, it is 85% in ductal adenocarcinoma, only 3%. The last 3 genes, they are exclusively present in ductal adenocarcinoma. That is KRAS, CDKN2A, that is atypical melanoma gene, and transforming growth factor, SMAD3, SMAD4, all are 0%. Okay, they are absent in pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor, but KRAS 100% as we know in ductal adenoma, 25% in CDKN2A, and it is transforming growth factor beta, SMAD3 and SMAD4, it is 38%. This percentage they can ask because it is there in box, so kindly mug up this one. And coming to the previous page, as I this next paragraph is just to see that I just summarize in that differentiation actually. Well differentiated and poorly differentiated neuroendocrine tumor of pancreas. Here in well differentiated MEN1, DAX and ATRX, they are present in almost 50% of the patient. But men poorly differentiated, but DAX and ATRX are normal. Okay, in poorly differentiated. But another extra 3 mutations they added, that is retinoblastoma, increased P53, and BCL2, that is anti-apoptotic. This one. they are increased in this one, poorly differentiated. That is what they mentioned in next paragraph. I have summarized just to make it easy. Okay, coming to general principle of diagnosis and treatment. So diagnosis and evaluation, nothing MCQ in that, so you can skip that one. Coming to directly screening. So in patient presenting with hyper-enhancing pancreatic lesion mass on cross-sectional image suggestive of pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor. So okay, and coming to next slide, it is in the absence of symptoms, a full hormonal screen is not necessary. So if a patient is having no, there is no symptom and all, so simply don't send all PP and our gastrin, glucagon level. Simply you need not send actually. And one more is chromogranin level have been shown to correlate with tumor presence in both functional and non-functional pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor. So this can be asked as MCQ, present only in functional, non-functional. No, it is present both in functional and non-functional. Is a useful for confirmation also in post-treatment recurrence. So another important MCQ they can ask is, which are the conditions where chromogranin level chromogranin A, okay, not B, chromogranin A level is increased. There are 4 conditions. That is PPI, atrophic gastritis, and renal failure and hepatic insufficiency. So you can remember is PPI and atrophic gastritis are similar conditions almost, and renal and hepatic insufficiency maybe because metabolism is impaired. So okay. So coming to localization. So whichever the tumor, first line is CT and MRI is the first step. Okay, whatever, because next chart also you'll be seeing CT and MRI is the first step in localization. So pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors, as we know, it is hyperattenuating. So coming to some points regarding CT. Okay, what is the slice we use is 1.25 mm cuts we should use, and improving sensitivity to improve the sensitivity. Okay, characteristically they see vascular blush in arterial phase is critical for the identification and differentiation from the other type of pancreatic tumor, which is less pronounced in venous space. That is, in arterial phase it is more pronounced and less pronounced in venous space. Okay, and this next line is very important, as I can ask as MCQ question. Use of water instead of oral contrast may assist the identification of small duodenal gastrinoma. So oral contrast is not superior to water. It is water is superior to duodenal gastrinoma. Okay. Then sensitivity of MDCT is almost 73 to, you can remember, 75 to 95%. It is directly related to 2 factors. One is, and one more is the location of the tumor. Okay, this also you should know. Coming to next, MRI. MRI, it is same. In T1 it is low. This one low signal, and T2 it is high signal. As we know, T1 is anatomy and T2 is pathology. So pathology is high signal in this one, T2, and it is and as in CT, it is also size is the related to directly related to the sensitivity. And coming to, there are 3 points actually. If there is a tumor is more than 3 centimeter, it detects all the tumor, MRI. Okay, if it is 1 to 2 centimeter, it detects only 50% of the tumors. And if it is less than 1 centimeter, it won't detect any tumor. That's was, as they mentioned, it directly related to the sensitivity. Okay, 3, 1 to 2, and less than 1. Okay, and overall sensitivity is 80 to 90%, whereas in CT it is 75 to 95%. Coming to endoscopic ultrasound, overall sensitivity is 90% for tumor of all sizes, better sensitive for detecting the smaller than 3 centimeter. Best diagnostic performance, detection and location of insulinoma. Okay, this case can be asked as MCQ. Best diagnosis, because insulinoma is the hardest to localize actually. That will come later. And best diagnostic performance in detection and localization of insulinoma. Limited ability to detect small duodenal tumors with sensitivity of only 50%. Overall sensitivity is 90%, better for less than 3 centimeter. But duodenal tumor, its sensitivity is very less, that is 50% only. Okay. Coming to scintigraphy, stomatostatic scintigraphy, you should remember all the percentage here actually. It keep on coming there repeatedly. So it is overall sensitivity is 80%. But excluding insulinoma, because insulinoma mostly lack a somatostatin receptor. So overall sensitivity is 80%. So 80 to 100% almost, and 90% with gastrinoma. So stomatocytoma are present in more than 90% of gastrin secreting neuroendocrine tumors. So it is 90% of sensitivity for gastrinoma. Okay. So stomatocyte receptor are also present in, so coming to next page, glucagon secreting and non-functioning, almost all non-insulinoma tumors, they are present only. Insulin secreted paraendocrine pancreatic adenocarcinoma does not process somatostatin receptor. So two tumors, which are the two tumors? One is insulinoma and one more is pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma, though don't have somatostatin receptors. So they are also useful in hepatic metastasis and from non-insulinoma neuroendocrine tumors. So only limitation is the anatomical precise location it can't make out actually. As written, it shall just show one blush actually. So to increase that one, to increase the sensitivity and to anatomical spatial resolution, SPECT they have introduced. Okay, sensitivity of SPECT is almost 96%, specificity is 97%. In this diagram, I have almost summarized all the sensitivity and specificity. First is CT, it is 75 to 95, MRI is 80 to 90, SRS is 80 to 100, except insulinoma, and SPECT is sensitivity 96 and specificity is 97. Among this, you can see most specific and sensitive is SPECT only. So if they, and it is SRS also, you can tell it is 100% is there. Okay. Coming to the previous page only, angiography for especially useful in insulinoma because they are hardest to localize. As I said, they are hardest to localize, and which is the, as I said, which is the most accurate is endoscopic ultrasound for insulinoma. So angiography detects approximately 70% of the insulinomas larger than 5 mm. Okay, showing characteristic vascular blush that corresponds to highly vascular nature of the insulinoma. So coming to next is portal venous sampling. So usually it is not done actually. Just remember, recently not done. Just to remember that which stimulates which release. That is calcium. Next page actually. Calcium will, we have to stimulate intraarterial injection of some stimulant, and you have to take the pancreatic vessel sampling. So which one will stimulate which one? Calcium will stimulate insulin release. Secretin will stimulate gastrin release. Okay, this one they can ulta, they can calcium to gastrin, secretin to insulin they can do. No, it is calcium will simulate insulin release, secretin will simulate gastrin release. Okay, arterial stimulation venous sampling has sensitivity of higher than 90%, but this is rarely necessary nowadays. Okay, coming to this previous flow chart. So nothing to mug up in this, just I have underlined this question which can be asked actually. Just to see which tumor can be observed, that is less than 2 centimeter, asymptomatic and non-functional tumor can be observed. Okay, and here as I said, in one nipple window this can be extended to 2 to 3 centimeters, that you remember. Coming to this right half of the chart is very important. First we'll do CT MRI. If it is not localized, endoscopic ultrasound, SRS or SPECT. If it is not localized, you go for angiography and stimulation. If it is not localized, directly exploratory laparotomy and intraoperative ultrasound. So this one descending order you should know, and this one. Otherwise, rest they can't ask any MCQ in that. So coming to treatment of non-metastatic symptomatic pancreatic neuroendocrine localized preoperatively. Okay. So extent of the resection depends on tumor type, location, stage, grade, and patient factor. This each tumor you will come to know actually. So the goal of procedure in most patients is to remove primary tumor, regional lymph nodes. Most neuroendocrine tumors, the surrounding normal pancreas has soft texture. Okay, increasing the risk of pancreatic fistula after partial pancreatectomy. Although generally less problematic leak than leak after the pancreaticoduodectomy. Leak after distal pancreatectomy and enucleus more common. So what they are telling is, see, because the tumor in the neuroendocrine tumor in pancreas, the surrounding, just surrounding the tissue will be very smooth. So if you operate, do any operation with that is distal pancreatectomy or enucleation, that is any pancreatic sparing operation, if you do, there is leak will be more common than pancreaticoduodectomy. But problem of the leak is very less than the pancreaticoduodectomy. Okay, and enucleation preserves the pancreatic parenchyma. Disadvantage is that regional lymph node is not sampled, obviously. So next next line is important actually. Knowledge of lymph node status allows for better determination of prognosis. Also, there is no proven therapeutic value to lymph node removal. This is important. Lymph node metastasis, if you remove the lymph nodes, there will be prognosis. You will come to know because of how much is involved in that. But the therapeutic value is not till now not justified actually. So coming to incidentally found small non-functional neuroendocrine tumor, nothing MCQ in that. So this page is full of images only. I'll come to that whatever written in losing data. So just come to this part. So that ENETs and NCCN guidelines for observation. Okay, just don't see that. Just to see, I have summarized in this paper actually. So regarding observation, this ENET, European Neuroendocrine Tumor 2016 and NCCN guidelines, what they are telling. So okay, when you will do observation, according to European, their observation is done in less than 2 centimeter if WHO grade 1 or WHO low grade 2. That is KSA 67 index should be less than 10% and no malignant feature on staging. But NCCN is telling observation less than 2 centimeters, same, but if it is non-functional, you observe. But European people are putting a lot of restrictions here. So how you will observe? European people telling endoscopic ultrasound and MRI both you have to do 6 monthly. If there is increased size 0.5 centimeter, do the surgery. But NCCN people telling CT or MRI, not the both. CT or MRI you do 6 to 12 monthly. CT just if indicated only you do. Okay, that is what that paragraph is telling actually. Coming back to that page again, this paragraph tells that only. Then comes to some studies actually. And Zhang and colleagues. Okay. It is nothing inside actually. They can ask mostly. I have summarized here what they can ask. All these studies know they are telling how much centimeter till how much centimeter you can observe, like that only they are telling on medial survival, all those things. So Lee and colleagues they are telling 1 centimeter, less than 1 centimeter observe, and Gojax they are telling 2 centimeter, Sadot 3 centimeter, Zhang 1.5 centimeter, Rosenberg they are not, this is single center trial only, they just mentioned actually. So just remember this number. Lee 1 centimeter, Gojax and colleagues 2 centimeter, Sadot 3 centimeter, Zhang 1.5 centimeter, and Rosenberg and colleagues. This is all name also you should be knowing. Okay. Coming to next, that is non-metastatic pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor localized preoperatively. So intraoperative, coming to some points regarding intraoperative ultrasound. Okay, how you perform? You should perform after mobilizing the entire pancreas. Okay, you should mobilize the entire pancreas. That means you are not found out preoperatively also, intraoperatively also. Then you decided to do ultrasound. You have to mobilize the entire pancreas. Then only you have to do ultrasound. And one more important MCQ is what is the frequency used here? 7.5 to 10 megahertz. 10 megahertz. Okay. For if liver if in the liver metastasis you are considering 5 megahertz. Okay, that is important. Then mass will be seen as sonolucent. Okay, sonolucent mass generally of uniform consistency, and color Doppler. Color Doppler we will use for 2 reasons. One is the vascular to see the adjacent vessel, how it is related to the vessel, and one more identification of the duct. Okay, in duct how it will identify? It will lumen will be there, but there won't be any flow. Okay, that the identification of pancreatic duct and adjacent vessels. That ductal system which show that lucent tube without flow. Identification of ductal system is useful to prevent pancreatic fistula formation after enucleation, obviously. Okay, coming to next, some of the treatment of metastatic disease. Almost overall 40 to 80% of the pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor present with metastasis. Okay, liver is the most frequent site that we did not mention. And long-term outcomes for patients with neuroendocrine tumor liver metastasis are more favorable than for patients with liver metastasis from pancreatic adenocarcinoma and gastrointestinal tumor. So prognosis in neuroendocrine tumor, pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor metastasis to liver is better. Okay, and Negri and colleagues, okay, they are telling in liver disease from neuroendocrine tumor, multidisciplinary care should be given. Okay, that is what they are telling. Coming to liver surgery for metastatic disease. Potentially curative surgery is possible in 10 to 25% of the patients. Okay, potentially curable. So resection is recommended if more than 90% of the disease can be removed. Okay, this will be changed. I'll tell later on. But just now remember, only if it is more than 90% of the metastasis, if you can remove, then only you do the resection. Other don't do. So only 10 to 25% will be resectable. So to make that resection curative, they are following some 3 criteria. That is grade 1 and grade 2 tumor, absence of distal lymph node metastasis, and absence of extrahepatic and peritoneal metastasis. If these 3, then you go for the surgery. Okay, then the prognosis will be better. After resection, even curative recurrence rate is almost 80%. Okay, recurrence rate is almost 80%. Yesterday, one more point, one more tumor where we read recurrence is 80%. Anyone can tell? Recurrence is 80%.
Fibrolumbar.
Yes, fibrolumbar HCC also recurrence is high, 80%. Here also recurrence is high, 80%. Okay. However, despite this high recurrence, the overall 5-year survival will be 85%. Means it is survival is good even after recurrence also. So there is no randomized trial comparing liver resection to other treatment for metastatic endocrine tumors. Long-term survival after surgical resection compared to other liver observational studies only. So there are 2 studies here. One is Elias and colleagues. Okay, what they are doing, they are comparing partial hepatectomy versus chemoembolization. Okay, partial hepatectomy was chemoembolization. But a partial hepatectomy is better. They are telling Elias and colleagues. And debulking for unresectable metastatic disease remains controversial, but is reasonable in the setting of G1 and G2. That is grade 1 and grade 2 disease localized to liver in good surgical candidates. Current consensus is that debulk is warranted if more than 90% of the tumor can be resected. This already I have mentioned. Only if it is more than 90% of the metastatic liver disease, if you can remove, then only you do the resection. Otherwise, don't do. But this Morgan and colleagues, no, they are telling threshold you can keep it to 70%. Okay, according to Morgan and colleagues, if you can remove up to 70% of the liver to metastasis, then you can go for the surgery. So debulking, in addition, debulking surgery improves the effect of subsequent loco-regional treatment. Okay. Coming to next page. Coming to some of the liver-directed therapy, all this radio frequency ablation, cryoablation, all those things, not considered curative here, as in HCC. Okay, because of significant morbidity will be there, abscess, cholecystitis, liver failure, and all. Generally reserved for the patient with symptomatic disease that is not amenable to surgical resection. Okay, only patient who are not amenable to surgical resection, then only you have to do. Coming to radio frequency ablation to treat unresectable metastasis smaller than 5 centimeter. Okay, and there you can do radio frequency ablation. As we know, yesterday, transarterial therapy, multifocal and highly vascular nature, endocrine liver metastasis, particularly suited for the transarterial therapy. This is all like similar to our Barcelona staging system. What are all the material you use here? Okay, there are some 4 material: lipodal gel form, gel form particles, polyvinyl alcohol foam, and bland microspheres. Okay. And intratumoral concentration in transarterial chemoembolization exceeds 20 times the concentration achieved in the systemic therapy. Okay, and selective intraarterial radiotherapy consists of embolization with yttrium-90 microsphere and has been shown to have response rate of 55% with overall control rate of almost 90% at 3 months. So this you can remember or skip also. Coming to next to cytotoxic and targeted systemic chemotherapy. That is, first is somatostatin analog. So mainly you have to know almost 3 drugs. One is octreotide and lanreotide. As I written above, you can see octreotide and lanreotide act on 2 and 5, type 2 and 5 receptors, and pasireotide 1, 2, 4, 5, and no 4. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 5, no 4. Okay, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 receptors, but pasireotide acts on all the 4 except number 4. Okay, octreotide and lanreotide act on 2 and 5. Okay. Then as we read in this small bowel neuroendocrine tumor, this PROMID and clarinet trial is coming here also. Okay, just remember in this PROMIT trial, as we know, they used here is long-acting stomatostatin analog. But here just uh, um, demonstrated that time to progression in patient with metastatic well-differentiated this one second. For this reason, cholecystectomy should be performed because we are using long-standing octreotide, which can cause cholestasis. Cholecystectomy should be performed. So PROMIT trial is included. One more difference in this CLARINET and PROMIT trial we should be knowing, because PROMIT trial included only patient with limited liver involvement, that is less than 10% or already resected primary tumor. But CLARINET, as we know, last line you can see there is regardless of the tumor volume. Okay, and CLARINET it use lanreotide they use. Okay, that's what we know only CLARINET and PROMIT. Rest all is same only. Just remember that tumor burden is considered in less in PROMIT trial, and they didn't mention anything about in CLARINET trial. Okay, and coming to next paragraph, that is poorly differentiated neuroendocrine carcinoma behave more aggressively and respond better to cytotoxic chemotherapy than well differentiated. So chemotherapy works better in poorly differentiated, and it is but chemotherapy still have a role in unresectable low grade neuroendocrine tumor. So chemotherapy acts better in poorly differentiated tumor, but have some role in low grade tumor also. So coming to next paragraph is just remember that I have written in the next up actually. Okay, here I have written that grade 1 and 2 streptozocin, 5-fluorouracil and epirubicin preferred. Okay, but high grade with poor differentiation, platinum based regimen is preferred. Okay, rest and all don't need to remember. Okay, you will forget actually. Then comes is everolimus is the mTOR inhibitor. We know it increases the median survival also and long-term free survival. It is a FDA approved drug, as I mentioned before. And next is sunitinib. Okay, sunitinib, as yesterday we read about sorafenib, what all it inhibits. Sunitinib also we should know, that is one is platelet-derived growth factor, vascular endothelial growth factor receptor 1 and 2, no 3. Okay, and proto-oncogene, c-KIT and CD135. Okay, these are the four inhibition it will do. In both of these drugs, that is everolimus and sunitinib, targeted therapy have been approved by FDA together with somatostatin analog have been largely replaced the cytotoxic chemotherapeutic drug in the management of well-differentiated neuroendocrine tumor. Coming to last, it is a radio-labeled somatostatin analog, that is yttrium and lutetium. Okay, complete response very rarely seen. Okay, 0 to 6%. But to partial regression is seen is up to 35%, but stabilization is seen up to 80%. Means this radio label, no, they mostly stabilize, very less they regress, and very almost complete response is almost very less, 0 to 6% only. Okay, coming to liver transplantation for metastatic neuroendocrine tumor. Okay, for the disease which are usually does not spread beyond the liver. Okay. The unresectable neuroendocrine metastasis is the only metastatic condition for the transplantation. Apart from this metastatic disease, other metastasis, liver transplantation would be considered. Okay, coming to Milan criteria for this one. Okay, you know Milan criteria for HCC. Here also they do one Milan criteria. Apply. There is six points. If you strict this liver transplantation for these points, there is 5 years overall survival, almost 90% is there. That is, one is young age less than 55 years, well differentiated tumor, Ki proliferative index less than 5%. Okay, they may give this MCQ as less than 10% and all. So just notice less than 5%, completely resected primary tumor with portal drainage. Means whichever the tumor having portal drainage, no, that you should be you should be removed, and less than 50% of the liver involvement and absence of extrahepatic disease. These 6 points is Milan criteria. Coming to next page, which are the poor worst outcome is hepatomegaly and high grade tumor, major or minor extrahepatic tumor resection at the time of liver transplantation. They are all having poor outcome. Okay, Next, coming to individual tumor, first is insulinoma. Okay, this is the most common, usually most common paraneuroendocrine tumor is non-functioning tumor only. Okay, but the most common functioning is insulinoma. As we know, Whipple triad or France triad, it is neuroglycopenic symptoms one, and it is at that time there will be low low sugar level, and also relief of the symptoms after this one. That triad we know. There are two types of symptoms will be there. That is sympathetic, because over sympathetic system overactivity because of the hypoglycemia, and central nervous system. Just to remember, hypoglycemia, fatigue, weakness, hunger, tremor, diaphoresis, all those things, sympathetic nervous system, and central nervous system, irritability, anxiety, excitement, all those things. In many patients, symptoms have been present for the years before diagnosis. So what they do, because of the hypoglycemia, they will be keep on eating, there will be weight gain will be there in insulinoma. Okay, that they can ask, weight gain will be there. So average age at presentation is 45 years, and insulinoma is distributed equally throughout the not head, body, or tail, it is equally. And rarely they can be present in another three areas, that is duodenum, splenic hilum, and gastrocolic ligament. Typical size of insulinoma is 1 to 1.5 centimeter, and most tumor tend to be benign. That is 85 to 95% is benign. Only 5% they will be tend to be malignant. Those 5% are associated with men. Okay, more likely to be multiple and malignant. Okay, coming to diagnosis. In the setting of suspected hypoglycemia, blood glucose should be measured precisely and should not using home reflectance meter, and reflectance meter are not sufficiently labeled in the low range. Okay, so not that home glucometer and all. I think they are mentioning about the laboratory value only. So that's why we admit the patient for that 24 hours test. No, and coming to next page, that is gold standard. Gold standard for the diagnosis of insulinoma is 72-hour monitor test, and in cases where hypoglycemic episodes are observed, and above laboratory testing can be obtained and monitored fast. Fast is not necessary. Okay, coming to this test, what are the some of the MCQ they can ask in the 72-hour monitoring fast? That is, patient can drink calorie-free and caffeine-free beverages. Okay, during this fasting they can drink calorie-free and caffeine-free beverages. And what are the parameters you measure? That is 5 parameters. Okay, glucose, insulin, C-peptide, proinsulin, and beta hydroxybutyrate you should be measuring every 6 hourly until the glucose level is 60 mg per deciliter. Okay, after this, once the blood glucose is 60 mg per deciliter, you skip glucose and beta hydroxybutyrate. Measure only insulin, C-peptide, and proinsulin. Okay, insulin antibody also you should measure, but need not measure only when this hypoglycemia and all. Okay, the fast is stopped once the glucose level is 55 milligram deciliter, or when the patient develops the symptoms. And last 3 line is important. That is 2/3 to 3/4 of the patient develop symptoms within 24 hours of the starting of fasting, but 95% will develop within 78%. Okay. As we know, one more symptom that is non-insulinoma, pancreatogenesis, hypoglycemia syndrome, and insulinoma. How you differentiate? Usually, it is difficult to differentiate actually, and it is documented. It is difficult in the absence of documented pancreatic tumor consistent with insulinoma. So it occurs more commonly in postprandial. Okay, that next box I will be showing actually. This NIPHS, no, there is postprandial setting, where here it is fasting. No, insulinoma symptoms will be in the fasting. So evaluating insulin to glucose ratio is also useful. That is, if it is more than 3.3 insulin in micro unit per ml divided by glucose in milligram per deciliter, if this ratio is more than 0.3, it is suggestive of insulinoma. But I have made a written here actually. So confusion here. Just see that above line which I have written. This insulin to glucose ratio, if more than 0.3, it suggests insulinoma. But it can be also seen in this insulin and glucose level is more than 0.3. No, this is also seen in insulin resistance and obesity. Okay, but here there is no hypoglycemia. That you should be knowing. Obesity and insulin resistance, insulin will be more compared to glucose, but there is no hypoglycemia. Okay, compared to insulinoma. So that is one important. And coming to next, this one, C peptide level higher than 1.2 microgram per ml plus glucose level less than 20 milligram per deciliter are also highly suggestive of insulinoma. That is also I have written in the next slide. Okay, that is also highly suggestive. C peptide level more than 1.2 microgram plus glucose level less than 40 milligram per deciliter. Okay. Next, beta hydroxybutyric. Some of the points, due to anti-ketogenic effect of insulin, all patients with insulinoma have serum beta hydroxybutyric level less than 2.7 millimole at the end of the fast. Okay, beta hydroxybutyric level more than 2.7 and the brisk plasma glucose level response to intravenous glucagon support their diagnosis of insulinoma. In cases of borderline, borderline insulin or C-peptide levels or suggest an insulin-like growth factor mediated process when insulin levels are low. Okay, this is also a little confusing here. So I have written in that last part, at the right corner, if you see, if a beta hydroxybutyrate is high, okay, there are two chances. One is low insulin. Okay, if it is low insulin, you consider it is because of insulin-like growth factor mediated. But if it is borderline, it is in the insulin associated with a borderline insulin level, C-peptide and pro-insulin level, you consider it as insulinoma. That is what they are telling. Okay. Coming to this box actually, what all they can ask this MCQ already I highlighted actually. Okay, that insulinoma and NIPHS, how you differentiate, because timing of the hypoglycemia you have to see. That is postprandial. Postprandial in NIPHS and post gastric bypass hypoglycemia, there will be postprandial hypoglycemia. There is nothing related, because insulinoma is a tumor. Insulin will be secreted irrespective of the diet. But here it is not a tumor. It is just a hyperplasia of the beta cell. So there will be postprandial. Only after taking the food, there will be hypoglycemia. And one more thing, in pancreatic cell mass, that's seen only in insulinoma. Okay, that also MCQ you can see. Coming to this surreptitious, these are all differential diagnosis for Whipple triad. Okay, means hypoglycemia and all those things. If you admit in coming to third differential diagnosis, that is surreptitious insulin administration, their insulin level will be very high. Okay, but C-peptide and pro-insulin level is low. Okay, C-peptide and pro-insulin level will be low. But if you do oral hypoglycemia, it is same like insulinoma only. Then insulin autoimmune hypoglycemia, you see insulin level is also very high, C-peptide level is also very high, pro-insulin level is also very high. Okay, and in IGF mediated, insulin level is very low, less than 3. Insulin is normal here. It is everything will be based on insulin like growth factor. Okay. Then other things, there is no MCQ here. Then that's all. Then you can, if they give, you can differentiate and you can. Coming to localization and treatment, only difference in insulinoma is that SRS is not indicated as rarely express the somatostatin receptor, we know only, and more than 90% of the insulinoma are benign. More than 90% of the insulinoma are benign. Enucleation is usually preferred. Okay, enucleation is not preferred performed if the tumor is within 2 mm of the main pancreatic duct, which is identified by the intraoperative ultrasound. So if usually insulinoma, we know it is more benign only. If it enucleation is the treatment of choice for insulinoma. But if it tumor is very pancreatic duct, we don't do enucleation. We do resection only, anatomic resection like next page is given. Anatomic resection like distal pancreatectomy, central pancreatectomy, or pancreaticodelectomy. Okay. Pre-operatively, some important consideration you have to do to prevent hypoglycemia is administration of diazoxide, decrease the beta cell release of insulin. How you administer 3 mg per kg divided into 3 doses. Okay. Coming to next paragraph, it is unlikely event in which tumor cannot be localized with preoperative or intraoperative technique by intraoperative techniques. After intraoperative ultrasound also you are not identifying, then you consider this NIPHS. that is nesidioblastosis. In this setting, you can do distal pancreatectomy, but here it is controversial. Okay, means that you have to open the abdomen for operating for insulinoma, but you are not at all finding the tumor. Okay, then you take the biopsy and do distal pancreatectomy, considering it is a nesidioblastosis. That is what they are telling. But doing the distal pancreatectomy in this patient, it is a controversial only. Okay. After life expectancy should be normal after complete excision of benign insulinoma, because prognosis is good. And after tumor debulking also, if you can't remove everything, after tumor debulking also, biochemical cure because some residual disease may not be functional. Even though little bit residual is there, you can obtain complete biochemical cure, because residual the tumor may not be functional. Okay. If metastatic disease is there, all those things, somatostatin analog, embolization, diazoxide, streptozotocin, all those things you can do. Even with metastasis, median survival is almost 5 years. So insulinoma is having a good prognosis. So coming to gastrinoma. So gastrinoma, the mean age of presentation is 50 years. So in insulinoma, it is 40 years. So more common in men. Gastrinoma, it is 60% is in men and rest in women, and sporadic in 75%, and associated with men one in 25%. Whereas in insulinoma, we know it is sporadic almost in 85 to 95%, only 5% associated with men one. Gastrin produced by islet cell tumor is not subject to normal stimulation of amino acid, peptide, or gastric distension, or not suppressed by high luminal pH. But can be stimulated by secretin. Okay, this you can do. The normal physiologic stimulation and inhibitory factor for gastrin won't work, but if you give secretin, it will stimulate. Okay, this last line can be an MCQ. Okay, then what are the clinical feature? Refractory peptic ulcer. Okay, which is the most common site is duodenum, and it is but jejunal ulceration may also occur. But if jejunal ulceration occurs, so you consider it is highly suspicion of gastrin secreting paraendocrine neurotumor. So approximately 75% of the patient, I have written here actually, clinical feature, 75% of the patient present with abdominal pain, and 2/3 of the patient present with diarrhea, 10% of the patient is present diarrhea only, okay, only diarrhea, okay, and 1/3 of the patient will present with GID. How you differentiate the diarrhea, this diarrhea from other forms of diarrhea is by NG aspiration. If you do, diarrhea will be decreased in Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. Okay, coming to the site, actually 90% of the gastrinoma are located within the gastrinoma triangle. See, I have written here 90% is within the gastrinoma triangle, where in gastrinoma triangle is more common in duodenum. In duodenum, it is more common in D1. Okay, D1, that is 60%. Okay, coming to this part, 60%. So gastrinoma occasionally localized to lymph node, but here the last 3 lines you see, it is unclear whether the lymph node can be true primary site or for gastrinoma, or whether they present metastasis from the occult primary tumors in the duodenum or pancreas. So it is a doubt whether a tumor is arising directly from the lymph node, or it is tumor is from the metastasis from the pancreas or duodenum. Okay, coming to diagnosis, you should know the upper level of gastrin level, that is upper normal level is 100 picogram, and it is a fasting level is 100 to usually fasting level we should see. If it is 100 to 1000 picogram, it is other causes of gastrin increase we should see, but it is more than 1000 is highly suggestive of the gastrinoma. So all people to measure the pH, all PPA should be stopped 2 weeks before. Okay, this can be asked 2 weeks before you should stop the PPA. And elevated serum gastrin level coupled with the pH lower than 2 in gastric aspirate is diagnostic of gastrinoma. Means any elevated level of gastrin level plus gastric pH less than 2 is almost confirmatory of gastrinoma. But if pH level is more than 3 is there, no, plus there is no acid reduction surgery, and there is no PP also patient not taking. So it is mostly, it is not a gastrinoma. Okay, that also you should know. pH less than 2, 1 MCQ. pH more than 3 also 1 MCQ is there. Okay. Coming to some stimulation test, that is the secretin. As I told, only secretin can alter the gastrin level in Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. That is secretin 2 international unit per kg is administered at 2, 5, 10 and 20 minutes after secretin administration. Gastrin level greater than 200 picogram after administration of noted in 87% of the patient in Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. This number you see 2, 5, 10 and 20 minutes after secretin administration you should measure. So there is no false positive. Okay, okay, that can be an MCQ, and the false negative can be observed if there is H. pylori infection. Means there is no increase of the gastrin level even after administering the secretin in gastrinoma patients. That is false negative. If there is H. pylori infection is there, false negative can be seen, but false positive is not seen in this test. Coming to localization, once the diagnosis is made, primary goal is to prevent the acid secretion. So best results is obtained by PPI only, proton pump inhibitors. So coming to next page, this box is important. This box I think we have seen in stomach also. The high gastric acid output, causes of hypergastrinemia. Okay, this cause of hypergastrinemia with high gastric output. How gastric acid output we left side though we know only, but right side where they can ask is this vitiligo and renal failure. Okay, there is hypergastrinemia but no acid output. Other though we know only H2 blocker, PPI, prior acid secreting procedure and all. Obviously acid secretion will be less only. Where we can get confused is renal failure and vitiligo. Okay, there is low acid output plus increased gastrinoma. So increased gastrin levels. Okay, this we should be marking. And coming to localization, CT or MRI, water should be used as a oral contrast. As I said before, not a oral contrast. Water is used. Water on CT scan for the better visualization of hyper-enhancing small duodenal lesions. Okay. SRS should be performed because almost all gastrinoma express somatostatin receptor. As I said, it is more than 90%. So sensitivity is also more than 90% for gastrinoma if you do SRS. Okay. Angiography, all of these patient measures are if all of these angiography you do, if all of this also unsuccessful, proceed with the operation and do intra-op ultrasound. Okay, that is same that chart what you have seen. Okay, operation is indicated to, if it is resectable, you resect, or also to decrease the symptom for cytoreduction also we can do operation. Okay, the presence or absence of malignant disease is the most important prognostic indicator. In 5 to 8% of the patients, surgeon is unable to localize the gastrinoma intraoperatively also. This percentage we should know. After exploration and intra-op ultrasound also, 5 to 8% of the patient we may not localize. Okay, and one more point which I show, the presence or absence of malignant disease is the most important prognostic factor. So which is the most important prognostic factor is, it is presence or absence of the malignant disease, as I written here. But the best predictor of survival is liver metastasis. So these two they can ask MCQ, not lymph node metastasis. Best predictor of survival is lymph node liver metastasis. Most important prognostic factor is presence or absence of malignant disease. Okay, and 5 to 8% of the cases you may not find after exploration also. So one more thing, exploration from where to you have to do full abdomen you have to do. That is from diaphragm to the pelvic floor you have to do. That also they can ask. Coming to next paragraph, that is transillumination of the duodenum with intraoperative endoscopy. Endoscopy may help identify the small submucosal tumor. Okay. Duodenal wall can be gently palpated between the surgeon hand after doing a 3 centimeter duodenum and anterolateral surface. Okay, not anteromedial, it is anterolateral. 3 centimeter you do. So you can detect smaller than 1 centimeter by palpating the hand. Smaller than 1 centimeter submucosal tumor also you can do. So this duodenotomy will detect 25 to 30% of the tumor not seen in preoperative imaging. Okay, this percentage is also important. So coming to most gastrinoma requires segmental resection only, that is distal pancreatomy or pancreatoduodectomy. Pancreatoduodectomy may increase the disease survival in patients with MEN1 because following local excision, recurrent tumors are most commonly found in duodenum. So if patient with MEN1, no, it is the pancreatic Whipple is better than the simply resection, because after resection in MEN1, I'll tell you later, the recurrence is more common, and that recurrence is more common in duodenum. So you remove with the duodenum. So resection of grossly positive lymphatic disease also increase the disease survival. Okay, that also they can ask as an option. And almost 50% of the patient initially free of the disease show symptomatic or biochemical recurrence in 5 years. So recurrence is almost 50%. Okay, and also this 50% will come next. 50% of the patient will present with metastatic disease. So coming to this treatment of metastatic disease, that pharmacological control, that is PPI. Okay, PPI to decrease the acid, surpass all this debulking, total gastrectomy, and all those things. So 90% of the acid tumors are controlled with 60 to 80 mg of PPA daily if you do. That is pantoprazole. So what is the how you titrate the dose of pantoprazole is the basal acid output, not maximal acid output. Okay, basal acid output less than 10 milliequivalent per hour you have to maintain. Okay, but if the patient is already undergone some acid reducing procedure, it should be less than 5 milliequivalent basal acid. Okay, not maximal acid. Okay, indication of total gastrectomy is obviously one is the Zollinger-Ellison syndrome along with carcinoid. One is the patient is not responding to PPA and all. Okay, and the last point is important, that is total gastrectomy will cure all the symptoms. Okay, but the progression of the metastatic disease and survival, it is having not at all any effect. Okay, and last line, stomatostatin analog used to decrease the gastrin release and subsequent acid secretion is rarely effective in suppressing acid without concurrent PPA use. Means if you are using somatostatin to decrease the acid, you have to use along with that PPA also. Only somatostatin alone won't decrease the acid. That is what they are doing. Coming to surgical therapy. Yeah, surgical therapy you should do aggressively. You have to do aggressive surgical therapy is indicated because patient have more than 20 years of lifespan. Okay, so aggressive. There are two type of tumor they are telling. One is aggressive, and one more is relatively benign. So aggressive form is seen in about 25% of the patient. Okay, and 90% of the aggressive tumor is located in the pancreas. So which is the most common site? I said it is gastrinoma triangle. In gastrinoma triangle, most common site is duodenum, but aggressive form is more common in 90% of the time it is in pancreas. Okay. So 10-year survival in aggressive it is 30%, and 10-year survival in benign it is 90%. So best predictor of survival for patient with gastrinoma is presence of liver metastasis. That's already I have written and shown you here. So best predictor of survival is liver metastasis, and most important prognostic indicator is the presence of malignant disease. Okay, there is nothing point regarding lymph node metastasis. So gastrinoma comes, forget lymph node metastasis. Okay, then comes your whereas lymph node metastasis not predictive. They already told also. So this can be asked MCQ. I think because liver metastasis is predictive and lymph node metastasis not at all predictive. Resection of all gross disease and metastasis may provide palliation of symptoms and long-term survival in 50% of the patient. Okay. Then comes VI-POMA. Coming to this VI-POMA, where all this VIP hormone is secreted. There are six places where VIP hormone is secreted. That is brain, G cells of antrum, adrenal medulla, gut mucosa, pancreatic neuron, neurons, and D2 cells of pancreas. Okay. That it will produce Werner-Marison syndrome or VI-POMA. Usually arise from this pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor usually arise from the D2 cells. Okay, this actually in this chapter there is a physiology. There are one table actually that I have not discussed today. You can go through actually in that. So this syndrome is called watery diarrhea. Now the WADA syndrome, watery diarrhea, hypokalemia. Huh?
Just admit the yogis.
Oh, Yogesh came. One second. Participant Yogesh not there.
Okay.
Yogesh came or what?
Just show the okay.
I'll continue.
Hmm.
I'll continue or wait.
Continue.
Oh, okay. 1 second. Okay. Hypokalemia and achlorohydria. Okay. Not hyperkalemia. It is hypokalemia, also called pancreatic cholera. Incidence is 1 in 10 million population, and more than 2/3 are malignant. Okay. These tumors are these last 2 to 3 tumors I am discussing. No, they are usually malignant only. 2/3 are malignant and 70% present with metastasis. Okay. And coming to site, 90% they present in pancreas only, VIP-POMA, and 10% they present in colon, bronchus, liver, adrenal gland, sympathetic ganglia. And more age of presentation is middle age. So if you can recall, what is the age of presentation of insulinoma and gastrinoma? Insulinoma is 45 years, and gastrinoma is 50 years. Okay, coming to this one rule of 10, which I have made actually. So 10% of the patient are diagnosed before the age of 10 years. Okay. And one more peculiarity in this people are elevated VIP level in these young patients are most commonly caused by ganglioneuroma, ganglioblastoma, and neuroblastoma instead of pancreatic tumor. Okay. They are usually from the neural origin, not from the in less than 10-year people. If the VIP-POMA arises, usually from the neural origin. That rule of 10 simply I have written there. And tumor are generally solitary and usually larger than 3 centimeter. So what is the average size of insulinoma? It is 1 to 1.5 centimeter, and here it is 3 centimeter. So easily identified on cross-sectional imaging. VIP-POMA is usually found in pancreatic body and tail. Okay. And 95 this same like this one only 90 insulinoma 95% are sporadic and 5% are your MEN1. Okay, this is important because Prev, anything you asked or what? Okay. And your in gastrinoma it is 75% sporadic, 25% MEN1. Insulinoma same like VIP-POMA, it is 95% sporadic and 5% MEN1. Okay, like that you can compare and remember. So diagnosis and treatment. So what is the mechanism how that VIP acts is in intestinal epithelium? No, they cell activate adenyl cyclase, increase the cyclic AMP within the colonocytes, and there is hypersecretion of fluid called watery diarrhea. So it is isoosmotic secretory diarrhea. It is the most common presenting symptom. So almost there is daily 3 to 7 liter of water loss per day. If your stool volume is less than 700 ml per day, no, so then you don't consider it is a VIP-POMA. Okay, usually it is not VIP-POMA. It is usually 3 to 5 liter per day. So this increased cyclic AMP also does one more mechanism, that is it inhibits the absorption of sodium and increases the secretion of chloride. Okay, that also one more mechanism it does. So there will be electrolyte imbalance also will be there. So this diarrhea is secretory diarrhea because even after you stop eating also diarrhea will be happening only. And one more this how to differentiate the Zollinger-Ellison diarrhea, that already I told. Nasogastric aspiration if you do in Zollinger-Ellison, the diarrhea will decrease, but not here. Okay, then how to diagnose? The normal VIP level is less than 200 picogram. If it is 225 to 2000 picogram, it should be diagnostic. It should be done after overnight fast only. Okay, coming to other abnormality, it is metabolic acidosis, hypokalemia. Hypokalemia can be seen. So there we can lose almost 400 milliequivalent of potassium per day. So because of that there will be cardiac arrhythmia, sudden death can happen, and almost 75% of the patient there will be hypochlorohydria, achlorohydria, and magnesium also can be decreased, and phosphorus also can be. Everything is decreased here: magnesium, phosphorus, achlorohydria, hypochlorohydria. Okay. So before doing OT, treatment is before doing OT, you should correct hydration and electrolytes. So somatostatin analog you have to give to decrease diarrhea. If somatostatin analog is not working, you can give glucocorticoid. Okay, the glucocorticoid has a role, may helpful. They may give as in MCQ, may not be helpful, not having any role. So glucocorticoid having a role. Given the high rate of malignant disease, a formal anatomical resection with negative margin, including lymphadenectomy, is required. Okay, no evidence to support debulking or for metastatic disease. So 2 points we came to know here. Enucleation and all what helpful. As I told before, there are 2/3 are malignant and 70% present with metastatic disease. It is a metastatic malignant tumor, no. So we have to do anatomical resection. And for the metastatic disease, debulking have no role there. Okay. So coming to next, glucagonoma. Okay, glucagonoma, it is more common in female. Okay, as we know, gastrinoma is more common in men, 60%, but it is more common in female. That is glucagonoma, 2 to 3 fold more common in female. And average size is 5 to 10 centimeter. I have mentioned above all the average size actually. One is insulinoma 1 to 1.5 centimeter. VA lipoma, as I told before, it is 3 centimeter, and glucagonoma is 5 to 10 centimeter, and somatostatinoma 2 centimeter. Just to summarize and kept actually. Mostly they are located in body and tail. Okay, even our VA lipoma also mostly located in body and tail. But gastrinoma most common location is, if you can recall, it is duodenum 1, and that is gastrinoma triangle. In gastrinoma there is duodenum 1, and insulinoma equally distributed in the pancreas. Okay. Body and tail, where that is the distribution of alpha cell in the pancreas. That glucagonoma are usually, they are also mostly malignant and mostly present with metastatic disease. Okay, and mostly they are also sporadic only, almost 95%, similar to your VA lipoma, and only 5 to 17% are associated with MEN1. So glucagonoma syndrome, it is not common. Okay, it is rare. They have given it is rare. They can tell on MCQ, and it is common. It is rare. There are 4 Ds you have to remember: diabetes, dermatitis, DVT, and depression. One thing you may confuse here, dementia. It is not dementia. Okay, it is depression. Okay, this characterized by severe catabolic state, weight loss, and depletion of fat. Whereas in insulinoma, there will be weight gain. Okay, in glucagonoma, there will be weight loss. So necrotizing vitamin D. Characteristic skin lesion is necrotizing migrating erythema. Approximately you need 2/3 of the patient often appears before other symptom of the syndrome. Okay, before other DD and all will come, this dermatitis will come. Okay, believed to be because of severe severe amino acid deficiency, in generally because associated with other malnutrition and vitamin deficiency. So parental administration of amino acids found to result in disappearance of skin lesions. Diabetes develops in 75 to 95% of the patient. Diagnosis of glucagonoma is measured by glucagon level. So normally fasting glucagon level is 100 picogram, and if fasting glucagon level more than 1000, it is considered diagnostic. Okay, glucagonoma they are easily localized, not like insulinoma. They are easily localized. Medical therapy to improve the nutritional status can be done, and octreotide is often required in conjunction with enteral nutrition for severe catabolic state, and prophylaxis again DVT we have to do. Okay, following resection, if there is no metastasis, no, 5-year survival is 85%. If there is metastasis, 5-year survival is 60%. Coming to somatostatinoma, so that is this diagram you see. Okay, diagram, this can come as image based. Here you see A is confluent patches of superficial necrosis, and it is B is serpendious margins. Something. So this image can come as MCQ. Then coming to somatostatinoma, it is exceedingly rare. Only 100 cases are reported till now. So what is the main feature here? No, here steatoria, diabetic mellitus, and gallstone formation. If these 3 is there, with or without this one, you just measure fasting somatostatin level. So if it is more than 160 picogram, it is highly suggestive of the diagnosis. So somatostatin usually solitary, and 85% they are larger than 2 centimeter. As I summarized, usually they are 2 centimeter. Typically 50 to 60-year-old. Here also, as I told, they are mostly malignant, 90% malignant, rarely associated with MEN1. And one more thing, they are associated with von Ruckling and neurofibromatosis disease also, and pheochromocytoma also. There are three associations, that is MEN1, one neurofibromatosis, and your pheochromocytoma. 5-year survivors only 3 to 60% after metastatic disease is detected. Coming to other tumors, so GRFoma invariably associated with MEN1, only 30% arise in the pancreas, and ACTH secreting tumors usually cause Cushing, and mostly most common others. And one more thing, MCQ they can ask is ACTH is associated with other neuroendocrine tumor. Most commonly it is ZDS. Okay, and they are usually malignant. Then one more, neurotensinoma. Okay, neurotensinoma. What are the features of neurotensinoma? They are usually malignant, and hypokalemia, weight loss, decreased BP, cyanosis, flushing, and diabetic mellitus. Okay. And lastly, they are telling this PPoma, neurotensinoma, and calcitonin secreting tumors are considered as classified as non-functional disease. But here you see neurotensinoma doing so much of clinical feature, so you mark accordingly. MCQ. So coming to next page, that is MEN1. Okay, coming to MEN1 associated with pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor. Pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor occurs in 30 to 80% of the patient of MEN1. Most common cause of tumor-related death in MEN1 patients. Okay, usually these patients are younger, mostly malignant, and usually multifocal disease, as we know, read before in all the topics. And 50% of the patient with MEN1 associated neuroendocrine present with metastatic disease. So mostly they present also with metastatic disease. Most common is gastrinoma, followed by insulinoma, followed by glucagonoma. Only VIPoma is only 1%. But PPoma, no, they are non-functional tumor, but they are the actually most common pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor. That is 80%. If you ask question, most common pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor in MEN1, it is PPoma. Okay, now don't put a gastrinoma. Only if it is functional, they ask, it is gastrinoma. Chromogranin A is elevated, that you can tell. And a hyperthyroidism, if present, should be hyperparathyroidism. If the present, MEN1 we know PPP na. Hyperparathyroidism should be treated first. Okay, because correction of hyperkalemia, I think they wanted to tell hypercalcemia or what. I think it is printed mistake. Will improve the outcome of the patient for pancreatic endocrine tumor. Okay. Then coming to gastrinoma in MEN1, there are some typical points which I want to highlight here. They can be asked as MCQ. There are 20% of the patient with ZDS have MEN-associated disease. Okay, as I know, as I told, 75% is sporadic and 25% is MEN1 associated. Okay, more likely to occur in duodenum. Okay, more likely to occur in duodenum. Means normally gastrinoma occur in duodenum only, that is 60% duodenum only, but here it is 60 to 80%. More than sporadic gastrinoma. Okay, it is duodenum and metastatic to lymph node and not liver. Okay, they won't metastatic to liver in MEN1 gastrinoma. They metastatic to lymph node. Almost 85% of the time of presentation, they metastatic to lymph node. Okay, this is one important MCQ. As we know, liver metastasis is the best predictor of survival, not the lymph node metastasis. But in MEN1, the lymph node metastasis occur in 85% of the patient, no liver metastasis in MEN1 associated gastrinoma. Okay, this we should be knowing. And MEN1 careful surveillance is indicated with annual esophagogastroduodenoscopy, removal of large, all those things we should do. Okay, then come this NI non-insulinoma pancreatogenous hypoglycemia syndrome, that is nesidioblastosis. What is this nesidioblastosis? It is excessive pancreatic B cell function with associated pathological changes. What are these pathological changes? Are islet cell hyperplasia, dysplasia with histological identification of B cells budding from and in opposition to pancreatic ductal structures. Okay, nesidioblastosis usually disease of infancy. So postprandial hypoglycemia, this is important. As you see in this box, there is only one cause for postprandial. Rest all is fasting. No, Other two you do. This is after giving insulin, this is after giving oral hypoglycemic. All are fasting. Only postprandial is two causes only. One is your NIPHS and your is a gastric bypass. So this is one MCQ. Postprandial hypoglycemia within 4 hours of meal is the hallmark. Okay, history wise, how you differentiate? It is within 4 hours of the meal, differentiate from the insulinoma, where it does not occur. Insulinoma is fasting, no, that is why we give 72-hour fasting test. May have 72-hour fasting test also positive. Okay, that is also an MCQ. And the final diagnosis only confirm that the pathologic examination of the pancreas. Okay, otherwise history only you have to make out. Otherwise pathologic diagnosis only. What are the pathology we know? That B cell hyperplasia, dysplasia, and the B cell budding from and in opposition to pancreatic ductal structure. Okay, treatment of NIPH include pancreatectomy. Most commonly 95% we have to do it is distal pancreatectomy we have to do, and dietary control and medical therapy with diazoxide and somatostatin. As you know, diazoxide decreases the release of insulin, and also somatostatin we can do. Okay. Coming to the another differential diagnosis, that is your post gastric bypass non-insulinoma pancreaticogenous hypoglycemia syndrome. This is recognized a complication of bariatric surgery, that is Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, constellation of postprandial neuroglycopenic symptoms similar to insulinoma, but in many cases it is more severe than your insulinoma. So what is the mechanism how it occurs is there are three theories. Okay, one, because there is already obesity induced B cell hypertrophy not reversed by Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, and also inappropriate growth factor release, and also persistent altered the gut hormonal signaling. These are the three mechanisms by which there will be this inappropriate insulin release will be there postprandial. So first line treatment is dietary control and medication. Okay, what are all the medication we know? Only glucose monitoring, acarbose, calcium channel blocker, diazoxide, and somatostatin along. Surgical intervention, you reverse. There are two options. One is distal pancreatectomy or reversal of the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. Okay, when there is refractory to the medical treatment, you can offer these two surgical treatments. But most commonly done is your distal pancreatic resection only. But even though after doing this surgery, after Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, there is symptoms will recur more often. Okay, coming to endocrine insufficiency after surgical resection, it requires 85% of the isolate cell mass to be removed. Okay, 85% of the mass to be removed clinically to type 1 dependent diabetes to occur. Approximately 20 to 50% of the patient will develop diabetes after the any pancreatic resection. Okay, so there are two types. Now, one when the patient is having a chronic pancreatitis, and when a patient is having pancreatic cancer. In both of these conditions, we do pancreatic resection, where the deficiency will be more. So chronic pancreatitis diabetes is be very common post-operatively. Okay, if you do any LPJ, ferrase, all those things, where the resection of the pancreas is done, if you have, for chronic pancreatitis, diabetes is very common. For pancreatic surgery, the decision is more polarized actually. It is not confirmed, with some studies reporting a high incidence of diabetes after resection of cancer, while others report the improvement in blood glucose attributed to the relief of the obstruction, ductal obstruction and all. So it is they may tell, some are telling that it will improve the symptom because ductal obstruction is improved. Some are telling it will cause deficiency. So total pancreatectomy, if you do, it is unquestionably leads to brittle diabetes because of lack of endogenous glucagon to balance exogenously administered insulin, and resulting the diabetes very difficult to treat. So total pancreatectomy means you are removing alpha cells also, so no glucagon. So coming to some of the treatment for diabetes, that is, one is autologous, one is allo transplantation. So coming to autologous, that is in patients with severe pancreatitis, where so autologous isolate transplantation, we know only the procedure, only the MCQ point which I have highlighted here. Because of loss of insulin, glucagon, PP, and type of diabetes that develops in patient in chronic pancreatitis similar to that of pancreatic resection. So in chronic pancreatitis, all the cells are almost damaged only because so it is almost like similar to the total pancreatic resection only. So how you prepare this one? Just to remember, the root is portal vein, and the two enzymes we use, one is collagenase and neutral protease. okay, to isolate this pancreatic isolate cell for the transfusion into the portal vein. Okay, these are the two MCQ I found here. Then one more is coming to next page here. One second. Last page actually. The initial, there are insulin after doing this autologous isolate transplantation, only 40 to 80% were insulin independent. But recently, the 10% of the only 10% of the patient remain insulin independent. Although insulin independence is not always achieved, most patients are C-peptide positive and have diabetes that is more manageable, that is less brittle. So this autologous has the best results. I have written here 3 points. No diabetic mellitus before autologous transplant, no previous pancreatic surgery, and younger patients. In these patients, there will be best results. Okay, and the most feared complication of this autologous transplantation is portal vein thrombosis. It is seen in 1% of the patient. So coming to this pancreatic transplantation, I said allotransplantation. Okay, don't read, just read this survival. Okay, graft survival. If you do it is simultaneous pancreas and kidney transplant, it is 85%. Pancreas and pancreas after kidney it is 78, and pancreas only it is 76. Means I don't remember the percentage. That is pancreas plus kidney. If you do simultaneously, the survival is good. Okay, and if you do pancreas after kidney transplant, it is little less, and only pancreas only transplant it is more or less. Okay. So after this transplantation, the improvement is retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, and all it's seen. Next, now one more last thing. This in addition, isolated transplantation requires 2 donors per recipient to maintain the graft function. Okay, how many donors is required for isolated transplantation? It is 2 donors. Okay, they may ask it 2, 3, or 4. It is 2 donors. Rest all I think it is 4 only. So any extra is there, you can add or.
What about the retinopathy?
Retinopathy also, they also experience stabilization of improvements in retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy. They are told only.
Okay. And in class, they told that retinopathy won't benefit, won't improve.
But they also experience stabilization or improvements in retinopathy. They are given. I have marked C 3 points. No, they usually won't ask this one. It is come in our transplantation chapter. No, I think they'll ask how much donor. I think 1 MCQ I have seen that how much donor is required. That is 2 donor. 1 MCQ I have seen. Apart from so, I have not seen anything. Any other? Sir, anything? Sir, I wanted to ask, sir. This glucagonama, no, this necrotizing migrating erythema. Somewhere when I was solving MCQ, I thought which amino acid deficiency, some detail is there or what?
Glutamine.
I don't know, glucagon or what?
Sir, that's what, necrotizing migrating erythema, sir. Here they are given only amino acid deficiency, which?
That I didn't see anywhere.
No, it was a glutamine.
Because
I didn't see, I refer until.
How glucagonama will cause necrotizing migratory erythema? Okay, that's all, sir. Otherwise, I know this one. Okay, sir. That's all, sir.
Okay,
anything is there, you can add.
Almost covered all points. We just summarize the sites, most common sites of all the carcinomas.
Site is insulinoma. See, it is equally distributed. Okay. Insulinoma is equally distributed. Gastrinoma, most common, 90% it is there in the gastrinoma triangle only. 60% it is there in duodenum. That also in duodenum it is D1. Okay, D1. And in MEN1 associated gastrinoma, it is which part? It is pancreas. Okay, 1 second, I'll confirm. I don't know. MEN1 associated it is duodenum only, but it is not 60%. It's 60 to 80%. More often it is this one only. And coming to next is your VI poma. Also, it is body and tail. VI poma and glucagonoma is body and tail. Somatostatinoma and all, they have not mentioned the site. Okay, these 4 only they have mentioned. Glucagonoma and
VI poma tail they told na tail.
body and tail only, I guess. Body and tail, I guess. Not only tail, body and tail in 75% of the patient.
Okay.
One they'll ask this. I think one their size. Okay, idea. The median size they'll ask. Insulin is 1 to, I have summarized already. Insulinoma is 1 to 1.5 centimeter. VI poma, gastrinoma they have not mentioned. VI poma 3 centimeter. Glucagonoma 5 to 10 centimeter. And stomatostatinoma is 2 centimeter. And one more is how much is sporadic, how much is associated MEN1. Each tumor, that is also important. Okay, almost your insulinoma, your VI poma, and your glucagonoma, everyone is almost 95 and 5%. But only your gastrinoma, it is 75 and 25%. Okay. Rest also, I think nothing is there to compare.
Okay.
And
once again, you summarize the table 39.5.
39.5. Oh, this table. Okay. This table, no, I have just highlighted the MCQ, not go into detailed point. This is see first column. You come by column. Okay. This is mainly hypoglycemia. Whipple triad, wherever they see, they have made a differential diagnosis. How you do? The glucose level is less in everywhere. Okay, that you leave. That won't help you anywhere. But insulin level is high in your insulinoma and insulin secreting NIPHS and all, and very high in your autoimmune. Autoimmune insulin hypoglycemia is very high. Okay, and insulin like growth factor mediated also, because it is not due to insulin, no, it is because of insulin like growth factor mediated. So insulin, C-peptide, proinsulin, everything is less here. So that is, but Whipple triad will be there here because of the insulin like growth factor. And lastly, last two things, beta hydroxybutyrate is decreased everywhere, increased only in insulin like growth factor mediated. Pancreatic islet cell mass, if you see in any imaging, that is only in insulinoma, not other differential diagnosis of Whipple triad. And timing of hypoglycemia, see only one odd man out is there here, is postprandial. The timing of hypoglycemia postprandial is seen in your post-gastric bypass hypoglycemia and NIPHS. Okay. Other end all only fasting. So these are all the MCQ they can ask. And this one, the third one, no, surreptitious insulin administration. So if you administer insulin too much, obviously insulin will rise only. But why C-peptide and proinsulin will decrease, I don't know. I wanted to ask someone, but that's what I remember. Insulin rise and C-peptide. Huh?
The C-peptide will usually rise from the endogenous insulin secretion. When the endogenous
okay, but why decrease? I don't know. Okay, mostly normalize, I guess, no? So insulin rise and C-peptide and proinsulin decrease, only one differential diagnosis, that is surreptitious insulin administration. Okay, very high level of insulin and C-peptide proinsulin is that autoimmune insulin hypoglycemia. Rest all almost same only.
What is the difference between these two last IGF mediated? Last two IGF mediated.
Last two, they not explain why they can be associated with that beta hydroxybutyrate. No, they almost everything same only. But in IGF related, no, it can be high also. They are telling. That's all.
Okay.
That's all they are telling. But mainly, no, if beta hydroxybutyrate is low, okay, because of the insulin level, usually if insulinoma is there, acidoblastosis is there, your ketone will be low actually. Okay, if ketone is high, what is the two differential diagnosis? I have made a chart here. There are two differential diagnoses. If beta hydroxybutyrate is high plus low insulin, you consider it as IGF mediated. Okay, but if beta hydroxybutyrate is high plus there is borderline insulin, C-peptide and proinsulin level, you consider it as because of insulinoma. That is what they have mentioned detailed in this paragraph. 1 second, if you want, I'll read also. Here, due to anti-ketogenic effect of insulin, all patients with insulinoma should have serum beta hydroxybutyrate level less than 2.7. Okay, if insulinoma is there, it should be less than 2.7. Okay, a plasma beta hydroxy level more than 2.7 and brisk plasma glucose response to intravenous glucose support the diagnosis of insulinoma in case of borderline insulin and C-peptide level, or suggest an insulin-like growth factor mediated process when insulin levels are low. Okay, when insulin levels are low, if a beta hydroxybutyrate is high, you consider it is because of insulin growth factor mediated. If beta hydroxybutyrate is high and if it is responding to glucagon and if it is a C-peptide insulin level or borderline, no, you consider it is because of insulinoma. That is one confusing point they have explained here. Understood? No?
Understood.
Oh, okay. Anything else is there? Or
Good man, good, very good.
Very good.
okay. Thank you, sir.
Very good. Okay, man. Nalagina, what tomorrow?
Tomorrow, sir, you are telling metastatic this one liver.
Okay, this small only, la. Very small topic.